Imagine walking into, like, the most brutal meat grinder of the ancient world.
Right, the Roman Empire.
Yeah, the Roman Empire. And doing it on purpose, not just walking in, but actually using their own imperial postage system, their constitutional laws, and even their elite palace guards to dismantle the whole machine from the inside out.
You're really looking at a masterclass in systemic subversion here. I mean, we so often view ancient history as this, simplistic narrative where the conquerors just completely steamroll the conqueror.
Oh, for sure. That's the standard textbook version.
Exactly. But the historical records we have surrounding the early Christian movement, they present this profound anomaly. It's a situation where the immense legal and military infrastructure of Rome was essentially hijacked to spread the very message it was actively trying to crush.
It's wild to wrap your head around. And welcome to this deep dive. Today, we've got a really fascinating stack of sources in front of us.
We really do.
We're looking at archaeological data, biblical commentaries, Roman historical records, and even a few, like, architectural travel guides.
Yeah, it's quite the mix.
And our mission today is to piece together for you the gritty, dramatic reality of the Apostle Paul's final years in Rome. We're tracing a narrative that involves a supreme legal loophole.
A really clever one, yeah.
The ancient world's most notorious dungeon, a miraculous prison break, and, randomly, a 19th century church fire.
It literally has everything.
Yeah.
But, to understand the mechanics of this story, we have to look at the socio-political landscape of the first century.
Right. Set the stage for us.
So Paul's journey to Rome was this deliberate collision of his theological purpose with the bureaucratic reality of imperial power. He didn't arrive in the capital as, like, a free citizen just booking passage on a merchant vessel.
Right. He was a prisoner.
He was a prisoner of the state, yeah. But one who had actively engineered his own transfer.
Okay, so the sources show this all really started with an arrest in Jerusalem. Paul was facing this lynch mob of local religious leaders who, viewed his teachings as an existential threat to their whole tradition. So he ends up in Roman custody, gets transferred to the coastal city of Caesarea, and then he basically just sits there. Like, a Roman governor named Felix holds him in a cell for 2 full years.
Right, and Felix was playing a very classic political game here.
How so?
Well, the historical consensus is that Felix knew Paul hadn't broken any major Roman laws, but releasing him would have completely alienated the local power brokers. And Felix needed them to keep the peace.
Oh, gotcha. So it's just a favor to the local aristocracy.
Yeah, he stalls. He just keeps them locked up. But, administrative turnovers happen. Felix is recalled, and a new governor, Festus, takes over.
Right.
And Festus wants an early political win, so he suggests moving Paul's trial back to Jerusalem just to appease those same local leaders.
Which Paul absolutely knows is a trap. I mean, if he goes back to Jerusalem,
dead.
Yeah, he'll likely be assassinated before he ever even sees a courtroom.
Yeah.
So put yourself in Paul's shoes for a second. You're standing in front of a brand new governor who is literally about to hand you over to a mob.
Oh.
You need a way out, and Paul pulls out the ultimate trump card. He invokes a legal provision tied to his Roman citizenship and just declares, "I appeal to Caesar."
It's such a dramatic moment. And that phrase, it triggered a fundamental constitutional right known as the provocatio ad Caesarem.
Okay, break that down for us.
So, in the complex hierarchy of the Roman justice system, citizenship wasn't merely a passport, right? It was this powerful legal shield. It basically guaranteed that a citizen couldn't be subjected to physical torture for a confession.
Oh, wow.
And it gave them the absolute right to bypass any corrupt, biased, or just hostile provincial magistrate. So by uttering those words, jurisdiction was immediately ripped from the local governor's hands. The case legally had to be transferred to the Emperor's Supreme Court in Rome.
Okay, wait, I have to push back on this strategy, though.
Sure.
Because appealing to the emperor sounds great in theory, but the emperor sitting on the throne at this specific time is Nero.
Yes, the infamous Nero.
Right. And Nero is not exactly known for his level-headed, compassionate judicial rulings, Demanding an audience with a notoriously unhinged autocrat, that feels like volunteering for a death sentence.
It does seem counterintuitive, right? But the genius of the move becomes clear when you look at Paul's overarching mission.
Okay.
He wasn't just trying to survive a local political squabble. He was actively trying to shift the geographic center of his movement. He knew Rome was the epicenter of the known world, like the hub from which all influence radiated out.
Right. All roads lead to Rome.
Literally. The Roman Empire had established the Pax Romana, which was this unprecedented era of relative stability, and they'd constructed this vast network of incredibly safe paved roads and shipping lanes, all unified by common languages.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah, Paul recognized that by invoking his citizenship, the Roman government was legally obligated to provide him with an all-expenses-paid, heavily guarded escort directly to the capital.
That is
He
brilliant.
leveraged the empire's own logistical infrastructure to achieve his goals safely.
He used the empire to fund and guard his own missionary trip.
Basically, yes.
That's amazing. So he finally arrives in Rome, but his living situation isn't what you'd typically picture for a prisoner of the state.
No, not at all.
Like, he isn't thrown into a dark cell right away. The sources describe him setting up, essentially, a 2-year house arrest in a rented dwelling. Was this actually a cozy setup?
Well, the concept of imprisonment in the Roman legal system was fundamentally different from our modern penal system.
How so?
Today, a prison sentence is the punishment itself, right?
Right.
But in ancient Rome, a prison was mostly just a holding cell where you waited for a trial or an execution.
Okay, that makes sense.
And because Paul arrived unconvicted, just awaiting an appellate hearing, and he held that protected status of a Roman citizen, he was afforded custodia militaris, military custody.
So what did that look like day to day?
It allowed him to rent his own quarters and receive a constant stream of visitors from dawn to dusk.
Right, he had a whole entourage operating out of this house. You've got Luke the physician, a younger companion named Mark, and this really fascinating figure named Onesimus.
Yeah, the dynamic with Onesimus is a perfect illustration of how Paul was subverting the system from the inside.
Tell us about him.
So Onesimus was a runaway slave who encountered Paul in Rome. Now, under Roman law, aiding a fugitive slave was a severe offense, and runaway slaves themselves could face brutal execution.
Oh, man.
Yet Paul writes a letter to Onesimus's legal owner, a man named Philemon, and actually sends Onesimus back to him.
Wait, he sends him back?
He does, but he attaches this profound caveat. He urges Philemon to receive Onesimus no longer as a slave, but as a, quote, beloved brother.
Wow.
Right. Without inciting any kind of armed rebellion, Paul is quietly planting these ideological seeds that totally dismantle the moral framework of the Roman social order.
And he's writing these letters, what we now call the prison epistles, like Ephesians and Colossians, while technically under guard.
Yeah.
And that brings up the physical reality of his house arrest.
Yes, the chains.
Right. He wasn't just sitting alone at a desk. He was permanently chained by the wrist to a soldier of the Praetorian Guard.
And the Praetorian Guard was the elite personal security force of the emperor. This was a highly trained unit of about 10,000 men.
So they weren't just standard beat cops.
Not at all. They received double the pay of regular legions, and they wielded so much political power they frequently acted as kingmakers. They would occasionally assassinate emperors they disliked and install ones they preferred.
Okay, think about the psychological paradox operating in that room.
Yeah.
You have an executed provincial preacher's follower, Paul, chained to a wall, technically the prisoner.
Right.
But in reality, you have an elite, double-paid imperial kingmaker trapped in a room on a rotating shift, forced to listen to Paul preach, teach, and dictate letters all day long.
Exactly. The power dynamic completely inverts. The historical texts note this profound irony where Paul's message began to penetrate deep into what was referred to as Caesar's household.
He was converting his own guards.
Systematically converting the very imperial bodyguards assigned to keep him contained. It's incredible. However, we really shouldn't romanticize the experience. The psychological and physical toll would have been immense.
Right, because he was still heavily dependent. Like, the state wasn't catering his meals.
No, not at all.
He relied entirely on a network of friends to bring him daily food and supplies. And the sources point out he was dealing with intense interpersonal drama, too.
Yeah, it wasn't all peaceful study.
He had local rival preachers who were, like, envious of his growing influence, intentionally trying to stir up political trouble just to cause him anxiety while he was chained up.
Which is just awful.
And he also faced brutal betrayals. One of his closest companions, Demas, abandoned him entirely because the pressure of the lifestyle just became too much.
The isolation and reliance on external goodwill definitely make those 2 years grueling. But the legal consensus is that this specific period of house arrest actually ended in acquittal.
Really? How did that happen?
Often, if accusers from a province failed to show up in Rome to formally press their charges within a certain time frame, the case would just be dismissed.
Oh, so the guys from Jerusalem just never showed up.
Likely, yeah. So Paul probably regained his freedom and traveled further west, possibly reaching Spain or Crete.
But the sources indicate that freedom didn't last. The narrative takes a drastic and honestly violent turn around the year AD 64.
Yes. The Great Fire.
Right, a catastrophic fire sweeps through Rome, just devastating the city. Emperor Nero is facing intense public backlash, with rumors swirling that he actually started the fire himself.
He needs a scapegoat.
Exactly, and he finds one in this rapidly growing, misunderstood sect called the Christians. This leads to Paul's second arrest. And this time, there is no rented house, no visitors from dawn to dusk.
The legal climate had completely shifted from administrative processing to active persecution. Paul was stripped of his prior leniencies and thrown into the Mamertine prison, which was known in antiquity as the Tullianum.
Now, whenever I try to picture a historical dungeon, I think of, iron bars and stone walls. But the descriptions of the Tullianum are entirely different. It sounds more like a subterranean nightmare.
It really was. To understand the architecture of the Tullianum, you have to look at its origins. It was constructed way back in the 7th century BC by Rome's fourth king, originally designed as a deep cistern to hold water from a natural spring.
Okay.
Over centuries, it was repurposed into an oubliette. That's a French architectural term derived from the word for forget.
Oh, that is chilling.
It refers to a dungeon with a single trapdoor at the top. Prisoners didn't walk into a cell. They were lowered through a small hole in the floor into a circular stone-lined pit 12 feet underground.
The sensory deprivation must have been just agonizing. The Roman historian Sallust actually described the environment centuries earlier. He wrote that the neglect, the absolute darkness, and the overpowering stench made the space hideous and fearsome.
Hideous is the right word.
And the only physical exit at the bottom was an iron door leading directly into the Cloaca Maxima, the main sewer of ancient Rome, where executioners would occasionally just flush the bodies of the dead.
Yeah, it's grim. And the location of the Tullianum is crucial to understanding its function, too. It wasn't hidden away on the outskirts of the city.
Where was it?
It was situated right in the bustling Roman Forum, directly adjacent to the Gemonian Stairs, which were also known as the Stairs of Mourning.
So it's basically the equivalent of building the federal execution chamber right in the middle of Times Square.
Precisely the right analogy. It was an instrument of psychological warfare. The state would execute high-profile traitors in the pit and then throw their bodies onto the Gemonian Stairs to just rot in public view.
Man.
The Tullianum was death row for Rome's most legendary enemies. Jugurtha, the formidable king of Numidia, was thrown down that hole and starved to death.
Wow.
Vercingetorix, the Gallic chieftain who famously united the tribes against Julius Caesar, he spent 6 years rotting in that dark cistern before he was ritually strangled.
And into that exact same pit goes Paul.
Yep.
The sources mention some incredible historical traditions that grew around this specific site, too. The most famous legend claims that both the Apostle Peter and the Apostle Paul were held in the Tullianum together.
Right, the twin pillars of the early church.
Exactly. And the story goes that they were so persuasive in the dark that their two jailers, men named Martinian and Processus, begged to be converted and baptized right there in the dungeon.
And according to the tradition, since they needed water for the baptism, Peter miraculously struck the rock floor of the cell and a spring gushed forth.
Which is an amazing image.
It is.
Yeah.
Analytically speaking, of course, we know the site was originally engineered as a cistern to capture a natural spring anyway, so groundwater naturally pooled at the bottom.
Right, right.
But the existence of the legend really highlights the intense spiritual significance the early community attached to their suffering.
Yeah, whether the water came from a miracle or just, 7th century plumbing, the reality is that the earthly journeys of both Peter and Paul ended under Nero's purge. And it's fascinating how the Roman legal system dictated the exact method of their deaths based purely on their civic status.
Status absolutely determined your vulnerability to state violence. Peter was a fisherman from Galilee. He held no Roman citizenship.
So what happened to him?
Consequently, he was subjected to crucifixion. The empire reserved that for slaves, pirates, and enemies of the state because it was specifically engineered to maximize public humiliation and prolonged physical agony.
The sources highlight a famous legend surrounding Peter's final days, known as the Quo Vadis tradition.
I guess.
The story says Peter was fleeing Rome along the Appian Way to escape Nero's persecution. As he's running away, he experiences a vision of Jesus walking in the opposite direction, heading directly into the hostile city.
Right.
Peter asks him, "Where are you going?" which in Latin is Quo Vadis. And Jesus replies that he is going to Rome to be crucified a second time.
It's a powerful narrative.
Yeah, at that moment, Peter realizes he can't outrun his calling. He turns around, marches back into Rome, and when he's sentenced to the circus of Nero, he requests to be crucified upside down, stating he isn't worthy to die in the exact same posture as his teacher.
Paul's execution, however, was fundamentally different. As a Roman citizen, he was legally protected from the extreme torture of crucifixion.
So what did they do?
Well, the state still demanded his life, but the law mandated a swifter, more honorable method. Paul was escorted outside the city walls to a location on the Via Ostiensis and decapitated with a sword.
Which brings us to perhaps the wildest piece of folklore in the entire source stack, the legend of the Abbazia del Tre Fontane, or the Abbey of the Three Fountains.
Oh, this one is something else.
It really is. The historical folklore claims that when the executioner severed Paul's head, it fell to the ground and bounced exactly 3 times. Bounced. And at each of the 3 distinct spots where his head struck the dirt, a spring of water spontaneously erupted from the earth.
Just incredible imagery.
The first spring was steaming hot, the second was lukewarm, and the third was ice cold.
And, you know, the abbey still stands today at that location. For centuries, those 3 springs became a massive pilgrimage destination. The faithful traveled from all over the world to drink the water, believing it held miraculous properties.
But the travel guides in our sources drop a hilarious and honestly slightly tragic modern detail.
Yeah, about the closing.
Right. They note that the water from these bouncing head fountains was distributed to pilgrims right up until 1950, when local authorities finally had to seal the springs off because the groundwater had become severely contaminated by modern urban pollution.
It is a really stark collision of ancient mysticism and modern reality, isn't it?
Totally.
But, you know, we have to look past the colorful mechanics of the bouncing head and spontaneous springs to understand the actual function of the legend.
What do you mean?
In an era long before GPS or formal historical registries, oral traditions and dramatic legends served as geographical anchors. The vividness of the story ensured that the early Christian community would never forget the precise geographic coordinates of the execution.
Oh, that makes so much sense. And that geographic memory proved critical because the story doesn't end in a dusty ditch.
Far from it.
The sources outline how a local Christian woman named Lucina quietly recovered Paul's decapitated body and buried it in a nearby roadside necropolis. Over the centuries, a massive shift occurs. The Roman Empire, the very machine that executed him, eventually bows to the message he was preaching.
Which is the ultimate irony.
Exactly. And that small grave becomes the site of an absolute architectural marvel.
Right. That geographical anchor led Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century to construct the original Basilica of St. Paul, outside the walls, directly over the site of Paul's tomb, which was initially just marked by a small memorial known as the Cella Memoria. Later emperors, specifically Theodosius, heavily funded massive expansions, turning it into this sprawling, gorgeous structure that anchored the southern approach to Rome.
Think about the sheer scale of that timeline for a second. That original basilica stood intact for over 1,400 years.
It's staggering.
It survived the utter collapse of the Western Roman Empire, waves of barbarian sacks, the Dark Ages, the Renaissance. It was a pristine time capsule of 4th century architecture.
Until it wasn't.
Right. On a random Tuesday in July of 1823, it just all vanishes. A workman is up on the roof repairing some copper gutters. He leaves a pan of hot coals too close to the ancient timber framework, and within hours, a 14th-century-old masterpiece is reduced to smoldering ash.
The destruction sent shockwaves through the global community. The reigning pontiff, Pope Leo XII, immediately issued an encyclical demanding that the basilica be resurrected exactly as it had stood prior to the fire.
Which is a tall order.
Extremely. While replicating a 4th century building in the 19th century presented immense architectural challenges. The lead architect, Luigi Piletti, orchestrated a phenomenal reconstruction.
And when you look at the logistics of that rebuild, you see just how global Paul's influence had become. Like, the donations pouring in weren't just local Catholic funds.
No, it was an international effort.
To rebuild the shrine of a Jewish tent maker executed by a Roman emperor, the Viceroy of Egypt ships over massive columns of pure alabaster.
Which is incredible.
And the Tsar of Russia donates incredibly precious malachite and lapis lazuli to construct the altars.
The architectural details of the reconstruction are stunning.
Yeah.
I mean, if you walk into the basilica today and look up at the windows illuminating the nave, they cast this warm golden light that looks like traditional stained glass.
Right.
But they're actually constructed from incredibly thin, translucent sheets of alabaster.
which was a brilliant pivot. Because the sources mention that in 1891, a massive gunpowder magazine at a nearby fort exploded, and the shock wave completely blew out all the traditional stained glass windows they had initially installed.
Just another disaster.
Right, so they replaced them with the Egyptian alabaster. But here is where the story gets incredibly modern. For centuries, pilgrims were traveling to this magnificent basilica, walking among Russian malachite and Egyptian alabaster, but expressing deep frustration because the actual tomb of Paul was buried deep beneath the main altar.
Entirely invisible to the public.
Yeah.
So the Vatican recognized the need to validate the site's historical core. Beginning in 2002, they authorized a rigorous 4-year archaeological excavation beneath the high altar of the basilica.
And what did they find?
In 2006, the archaeological team announced a monumental discovery. They had unearthed a massive white marble sarcophagus situated exactly where the ancient Constantine foundations indicated the original grave should be.
And carved right into the side of the marble was an inscription, Paulo Apostolo Mart, to Paul the Apostle and Martyr.
But the Vatican went a step further into scientific verification. In 2009, they permitted scientists to insert a tiny probe into the sarcophagus to extract samples.
Wow, real CSI stuff.
Exactly. They retrieved traces of red incense, grains of protein, and most significantly, fragments of purple linen laminated with pure gold, which is an unmistakable ancient sign of extreme wealth and deep reverence.
And they found bones, right?
They did. They extracted minute bone fragments. Subjecting those bone fragments to independent radiocarbon dating yielded results placing them precisely in the 1st or 2nd century.
So the science perfectly aligns with the timeline of his life.
It does.
It's an incredible moment where thousands of years of oral tradition, dramatic legends of bouncing heads, and modern radiocarbon dating completely intersect to validate a single spot on the map.
It is a tangible confirmation of a remarkable historical arc. You're looking at an individual who utilized the Roman legal code to force a confrontation at the center of the world, penetrated the highest levels of imperial military security while in chains, endured the psychological horrors of Rome's most terrifying weapon in the Tullianum, and left a legacy that resulted in a global monument standing directly over his verified remains.
He essentially weaponized the infrastructure of the greatest empire on Earth to ensure his message outlived the empire itself. Next time you find yourself frustrated and overwhelmed by a massive, immovable bureaucratic system, whether it's corporate tape, government structures, or just the grind of daily institutions, put yourself in Paul's shoes. He didn't try to tear down the Roman roads or burn the legal courts. He asked himself a more powerful question. How can you use the machine's own rules to change the world?